The snowmobiles coughed to a stop, their engines finally giving out after hours of cutting through the Antarctic wasteland. I pulled off my helmet and immediately regretted it. The cold hit my face like a physical blow, sharp enough to make my eyes water and my sinuses burn with each breath. The wind carried ice crystals that felt like needles against my exposed skin, and the silence that followed the engine's death was so complete it seemed to press against my eardrums. Russell was already climbing off his machine, checking his GPS against the coordinates we'd been given. Snow crunched under his boots with that particular sound Antarctic ice makes, crisp and hollow, like walking on broken glass. His breath formed thick clouds that dissipated quickly in the dry air. "This is it," he called over, his voice muffled by the thick scarf wrapped around his face. "Dead on target." I nodded and reached for the specially insulated case strapped to the back of my snowmobile. My gloved hands moved carefully, protecting what was inside. The metal was so cold it seemed to burn through the insulation of my gloves, and I could feel the weight shifting inside as I handled it. The case contained everything: the vials of experimental serum I'd extracted from the permafrost samples, and the small sample of Lucas's blood I'd kept frozen for 6 months. Russell didn't know about any of it. Nobody did. The case felt heavier than it should have as I secured it to my pack. Every time I handled it, I thought about what I was really doing here. The official paperwork listed this as a routine climate monitoring expedition, part of the ongoing research into permafrost degradation patterns across the Antarctic Peninsula. But that was a lie I'd constructed carefully, supported by falsified equipment requests and manipulated data points. This wasn't about the climate research we'd put in our official reports. This was about bringing my son back. Russell walked over to where I stood, surveying the landscape around us. Nothing but white in every direction, broken only by the dark slash of the massive crevasse that cut through the ice about 50 yards from where we'd stopped. The void looked deep enough to swallow buildings whole, its edges sharp and clean where the ice had split apart. The wind howled across the opening with a sound like distant screaming, and I could see our lights reflecting off the blue-black ice walls that disappeared into darkness below. "You want to tell me what we're really doing here?" Russell asked, pulling down his scarf. His breath came out in visible puffs that froze almost instantly into tiny ice particles that caught the light from our headlamps. "Because I've been on plenty of research expeditions, and none of them required this level of secrecy." I focused on unpacking gear from my snowmobile, keeping my hands busy with familiar motions. The equipment felt brittle in the cold, and I had to be careful not to crack the plastic housings on the sensitive instruments. "What do you mean?" "Come on, Andrew." Russell's voice carried a note of impatience I've been hearing more often over the past few days. "The equipment requests, the lack of oversight, the way you've been acting since we left Palmer Station, the route you insisted on taking, the specific coordinates you requested." He gestured toward the crevasse with a gloved hand. "You specifically requested this location, this exact spot. Why?" The wind picked up, carrying ice crystals that stung any exposed skin and made our parkas snap like flags. I pulled my hood tighter and kept working on the gear, feeling the familiar weight of deception settling over me like another layer of insulation. "We're here to study the permafrost degradation patterns, same as always. The formations down in that crevasse will show us geological changes we can't observe from surface samples." Russell didn't buy it. I could tell by the way he stood there, his posture rigid with skepticism, waiting for a better answer. His eyes, visible above his face mask, studied me with the same analytical precision he used when examining ice core samples. But I couldn't give him the truth. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The real story was too complex, too personal, too dangerous to share. 6 months ago, my 16-year-old son, Lucas, had been driving home from soccer practice when a drunk driver ran a red light. The impact had put him into a coma so deep the doctor said his brain activity was minimal, that the damage might be irreversible. I was supposed to pick him up that night, but a conference call about Arctic drilling permits had run late, and I told him to drive himself home instead. The guilt had been eating me alive ever since, made worse by Jennifer filing for divorce 3 weeks after the accident and moving out 2 months later. She couldn't stand watching me destroy myself while our son lay unconscious, hooked up to machines that kept his body alive, while his mind remained unreachable. But my research had led me to something unexpected. While analyzing permafrost samples from northern Alaska, I discovered microorganisms that had been dormant for thousands of years. The preliminary analysis suggested they might have regenerative properties, unlike anything in modern medicine. When the government research facility had confiscated my work and classified the project, I'd managed to keep one vial and synthesize more under the pretense of routine Antarctic research. We worked in relative silence, setting up our base camp while the wind howled around us. The temperature kept dropping. My thermometer read -38 and falling, and I could feel the cold seeping through every layer of clothing, searching for any gap in my protection. The shelter went up quickly. We'd done this enough times that our movements were automatic, despite the numbing cold. Russell handled the main structure while I focused on the equipment tent, making sure my case stayed close to me the entire time. Every few minutes, I caught Russell watching me with those analytical eyes. He noticed how I kept the case within arm's reach, how I checked on it between tasks, how my hands lingered on it protectively. The man was observant. It's what made him a good research partner for 15 years. But right now, his attention felt dangerous. The Antarctic landscape stretched around us in all directions, an endless expanse of white broken only by the dark wound of the crevasse. Above us, the sky was the color of old steel, heavy with the promise of more snow. The silence between wind gusts was so complete it seemed unnatural, as if the entire continent was holding its breath. "That case," Russell said, as we finished securing the last of the guidelines against the mounting wind. The fabric of our shelter strained against the gusts, creating a rhythmic snapping sound that seemed to echo across the empty landscape. "You've been treating it like it contains nuclear weapons." I forced a laugh that came out strained and artificial in the thin air. "Just expensive equipment. Can't afford to lose funding if something breaks." The lie felt heavy on my tongue, made worse by the way Russell's eyes narrowed above his face mask. Russell didn't respond immediately. He stood at the edge of our camp, looking toward the crevasse with the focused attention of someone who'd spent decades reading ice formations and weather patterns. The dark opening stretched away from us in both directions, disappearing into the white landscape like a scar across the face of the continent. From where we stood, I couldn't see the bottom, just an endless descent into blue-black shadows that seemed to absorb our lights. 40 below now, Russell said, checking his own instruments with practiced efficiency. The digital display glowed weakly in the growing darkness. "And it's going to keep dropping. We'll be lucky if it doesn't hit 50 below by morning." I nodded and moved my case into the equipment tent, my boots crunching through snow that had already turned to ice from our body heat and the warmth of the heating units. I placed the case carefully next to the main heating unit, feeling the slight vibration of the machinery through the tent floor. The serum needed to stay at exactly the right temperature. Too cold and the microorganisms would go dormant again. Too warm and the cellular structure would begin to degrade. I'd spent months calculating the optimal storage conditions, cross-referencing the stolen research notes with Lucas's medical files and the environmental data from similar Antarctic locations. The heating unit hummed quietly, a sound that should have been comforting, but somehow felt ominous in the vast silence of the continent. Inside my case, the vials of experimental serum sat in their custom foam padding, clear liquid that might hold the key to saving my son. Next to them, the small container of Lucas's blood looked impossibly fragile, the last sample. Taken before his accident, preserved at precise temperatures, while I searched for a way to heal his damaged brain. Russell appeared in the tent opening behind me, his bulky form silhouetted against the gray Antarctic twilight. He'd removed his outer gloves, and I could see his breath forming small clouds as he spoke. "We should talk about tomorrow's descent. I've been looking at the topographical data, and this crevasse goes down at least 200 feet before it levels out." "That's why we're here," I said, not turning around. My hands moved automatically through the familiar ritual of checking equipment temperatures and battery levels, but my mind was focused on what lay ahead. The deeper formations will show us permafrost patterns we can't observe from surface samples. The mineral composition down there, the ice crystal structures, it's all part of understanding how climate change is affecting the deep permafrost layers. Right, Russell's voice carried that same note of skepticism I'd been hearing since we left Palmer Station. Permafrost patterns. I busied myself with organizing equipment, arranging tools I didn't really need to arrange. The weight of what I was planning pressed down on me like the Antarctic cold, relentless and inescapable. Tomorrow, I would descend into that dark crevasse, carrying my son's blood and experimental serum synthesized from ancient microorganisms. According to my research, the unique environmental conditions down there would be perfect for what I needed to do. The extreme cold, the mineral-rich ice formations, the atmospheric pressure that existed nowhere else on Earth. If the serum worked the way I believed it would, I could repair Lucas's damaged neural tissue. The microorganisms had shown remarkable regenerative properties in laboratory conditions, and the government researchers had been very interested in their potential applications before the project was classified. But they hadn't understood what I understood, that these organisms needed specific environmental triggers to achieve their full potential. If it didn't work, I'd probably die trying. The descent was dangerous enough, without factoring in experimental medical procedures performed in sub-zero conditions, 200 feet below the Antarctic surface. But both outcomes seemed better than continuing to live with the crushing guilt that had consumed the last 6 months of my life. Russell finished his equipment check and left the tent without saying anything else. I heard him moving around outside, probably doing his own preparations for tomorrow's descent or updating his research logs. The sound of his boots on the packed snow was muffled by the wind, which had picked up again and was now howling across the crevasse with renewed intensity. Through the tent walls, I could hear the ice settling and shifting, the continent itself adjusting to the temperature changes with sounds like distant gunshots. It was a reminder of how precarious our position was, camped on the edge of a geological formation that could shift or collapse without warning, hundreds of miles from the nearest help. The heating unit's gentle hum provided a counterpoint to the wind's symphony, and I found myself focusing on the sound as I checked and rechecked my equipment. Every piece had been carefully selected and tested, every calculation verified multiple times. I couldn't afford any mistakes tomorrow. Lucas's life depended on my precision. I pulled out my satellite phone and checked the signal strength. 2 bars, enough for emergency communication, but not much more. The rescue protocols were clear. If something went wrong during the descent, Palmer Station would dispatch a helicopter within 6 hours. But 6 hours in Antarctic conditions could be an eternity, especially if the weather deteriorated further. Outside, Russell's voice carried on the wind as he spoke into his own radio, probably giving Palmer Station our evening position report. The routine nature of the communication felt surreal given what I was planning. In less than 12 hours, I would either achieve something miraculous or die in the attempt. The Antarctic night was settling around our small camp like a living thing, complete and absolute in its darkness. Night settled over our camp with the peculiar quality of Antarctic darkness, complete and absolute, broken only by the amber glow from our shelter lights that seemed to create a small bubble of civilization in the endless void. The wind had intensified, carrying with it the sharp, clean scent of snow and something else, something metallic and ancient that seemed to rise from the depths of the crevasse itself. Russell had gone quiet in the main tent, probably going over our descent plans or updating his research logs. I could hear the faint sound of his keyboard clicking intermittently, punctuated by the occasional rustle of papers and the steady hiss of the heating unit working overtime against the plummeting temperature. I stepped outside and walked toward the edge of the crevasse, my boots squeaking against snow that had crystallized into something resembling coarse sand. The cold hit me immediately, penetrating through every layer of insulation with fingers of ice that found the gaps around my collar and sleeves. My breath formed clouds so thick they partially obscured my vision, and I had to blink away ice crystals that formed on my eyelashes within seconds of exposure. The void opened up before me, a black mouth that seemed to swallow our camp lights and give nothing back. The walls disappeared into darkness so complete it felt tangible, and the sound of wind moving through the crevasse created an eerie whistling that rose and fell like breathing. Somewhere down there, in the ice formations and natural chambers that had been carved by millennia of geological activity, I would either find the answer I'd been searching for or lose myself completely trying to get it. I pulled out my phone and looked at the photo of Lucas I kept as my wallpaper, taken just 2 days before the accident, showing him in his soccer uniform with that crooked grin that made him look so much like his mother. The screen dimmed quickly in the cold, and I had to increase the brightness to see his face clearly. In the hospital, hooked up to machines that monitored his brain activity, he looked so much smaller, so fragile. The doctor spoke in careful, measured tones about traumatic brain injury and the possibility of permanent cognitive impairment. Minimal cortical activity, Dr. Martinez had explained during our last consultation. The areas responsible for higher cognitive function show significant damage. Even if he regains consciousness, there's no guarantee he'll be the same person you remember. But the research suggested otherwise. The microorganisms I discovered in the Alaskan permafrost samples showed remarkable ability to repair neural tissue at the cellular level. In laboratory conditions, they had successfully regenerated damaged neurons in test subjects with brain injuries similar to Lucas's. The government facility had been very interested in the implications for military medicine before they'd classified the entire project and locked me out. The cold bit at my exposed face as I stood at the edge of the crevasse, but I didn't move. The pain felt appropriate somehow, a physical reminder of the emotional numbness that had settled over me since the accident. Tomorrow morning, I would descend into that darkness, carrying Lucas's blood and a serum that might be able to heal his damaged brain. The possibility terrified and excited me in equal measure. Behind me, Russell's voice carried across the camp, muffled by the tent walls and the wind. "Andrew, you should get some rest. Big day tomorrow." I turned away from the crevasse and walked back toward our shelter, feeling the warmth radiating from the tent openings like a beacon in the darkness. Russell was right. Tomorrow would change everything. Either I would find a way to undo the worst thing that had ever happened to my family, or I would destroy myself in the attempt. Both options felt like a kind of salvation from the guilt that had been consuming me for 6 months. I woke to the sound of Russell moving around outside the tent, his boots crunching against the packed snow as he checked our equipment in the pre-dawn darkness. My watch read 6:43 in the morning, though the Antarctic night made time feel meaningless. The heating unit had kept the tent warm enough that I could actually move my fingers without stiffness, but I could feel the cold radiating through the tent walls like a living thing. Russell's voice carried through the fabric, professional and efficient despite the early hour. "Coffee's ready when you are." I pulled on my outer gear, layer by layer, each piece a barrier against the hostile environment outside. The ritual felt ceremonial, like putting on armor before battle. Insulated underwear, fleece layer, wind-resistant shell, insulated boots rated for 60 below, gloves within gloves, face mask, and finally the parka that would keep my core temperature stable in conditions that could kill an unprotected person in minutes. I stepped outside into air so cold it made my lungs ache with each breath. The sky had that peculiar pre-dawn quality unique to polar regions. Not quite dark, but nowhere near light, painted in shades of deep blue and gray that seemed to absorb rather than reflect illumination. Russell had already started organizing the descent equipment with the methodical precision of someone who'd done this countless times. Ropes lay coiled in perfect spirals, their synthetic fibers stiff from the cold, but still flexible enough to handle our weight. Climbing anchors gleamed dully in the light from our headlamps, their metal surfaces so cold they would burn exposed skin on contact. Emergency supplies sat in waterproof containers, everything organized according to protocols developed through decades of Antarctic research. But I noticed how Russell kept glancing toward the crevasse, his movements carrying attention I hadn't seen before. His usual easy confidence seemed strained, as if something about this particular mission was troubling him in ways he hadn't articulated. "Sleep okay?" he asked, handing me a steaming cup of coffee that felt like holding liquid fire in the frigid air. "Well enough," I said, though that wasn't entirely true. I'd spent most of the night thinking about Lucas, about Jennifer, about the choices that had led me to this frozen continent with experimental serum and desperate hope. I took the coffee gratefully, letting the warmth spread through my gloved hands and up my arms. The steam rose from the cup in thick clouds that dissipated quickly in the dry air, and I could taste the bitter edge of instant coffee mixed with metallic undertones from our water purification system. The case with Lucas's blood and the serum sat where I'd left it, carefully positioned next to the heating unit inside the equipment tent. Russell continued sorting through climbing gear with practiced efficiency, testing rope strength and checking battery levels on the headlamps. Each piece of equipment received careful attention. Carabiners opened and closed to ensure smooth operation despite the cold. Headlamp beams tested for clarity and focus. Emergency beacons activated and verified. But his movements carried an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there during previous expeditions. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," Russell said, his breath forming small clouds as he worked. "About the permafrost patterns we're supposed to study down there." I focused on my coffee, using the ritual of drinking to buy time. The liquid was almost too hot to handle, but the warmth felt necessary in the face of what was coming. Around us, the Antarctic landscape stretched endlessly, painted in shades of blue and gray under the pre-dawn sky. "The thing is," Russell continued, straightening up and turning toward me, "I've looked at the topographical surveys for this area, checked the mineral composition reports, the ice density studies, everything we supposedly came here to research. His voice carried a note of careful control, like someone trying to remain professional while discussing something deeply personal. There's nothing particularly interesting about this location from a geological standpoint. Nothing that would justify the kind of equipment you requested or the level of secrecy you've maintained. The coffee had gone lukewarm in my hands, but I continued to hold it like a shield against the conversation I'd been dreading. Russell stood about 10 feet away, holding a coil of climbing rope, waiting for an answer I didn't want to give. His eyes above the face mask studied me with the same analytical precision he used when examining ice core samples, looking for patterns and anomalies. "So I'm going to ask you again," he said, his voice quieter now, but somehow more intense. "What are we really doing here, Andrew?" I set down the cup carefully, placing it on a flat section of packed snow where it wouldn't tip over. The wind had died down temporarily, leaving us in a pocket of relative silence that made every word feel more significant. I walked toward the equipment tent, my boots crunching through snow that reflected our headlamp beams like scattered diamonds. Russell followed, matching my pace across the uneven surface. His breathing was audible in the thin air, steady and controlled, despite the tension radiating from his posture. Inside the tent, I knelt next to my case and stared at it for a long moment, feeling the weight of 6 months of deception pressing down on me. "Andrew," Russell's voice had gotten quieter, almost gentle. My hand shook as I opened the case, the latches clicking softly in the insulated space of the tent. The vials of serum sat in their custom foam padding, clear liquid that caught the light from our headlamps and seemed to glow with its own inner illumination. Next to them, the small container of Lucas's blood looked impossibly fragile, a tiny vessel holding what might be my son's only chance at recovery. "My son has been in a coma for 6 months, I said without looking up, my voice barely above a whisper. "Lucas Pemberton. He's 16 years old. He was driving home from soccer practice when a drunk driver hit him." Russell didn't respond immediately. I heard him move closer, his heavy breathing audible in the confined space of the tent. The heating unit hummed quietly between us, a sound that seemed to emphasize the silence that stretched between my words. "The doctors say the brain damage might be permanent," I continued, lifting one of the vials so Russell could see the clear liquid inside. "That he might never wake up. That even if he does, he might not be..." My voice cracked on the last words, and I had to pause to regain control. "This is an experimental neural regeneration serum," I said, holding the vial steady despite my shaking hands. "I synthesized it from microorganisms I found in permafrost samples, ancient organisms that have been dormant for thousands of years but show remarkable regenerative properties when activated under specific conditions." Russell made a sound that might have been a sharp intake of breath, visible as a small cloud in the cold air. "The government confiscated my research 6 months ago, classified the entire project, and locked me out," I continued, placing the vial back in its holder and picking up Lucas's blood sample. "But I kept enough samples to continue the work. The research suggested that under specific environmental conditions, extreme cold, low atmospheric pressure, certain mineral compositions in the surrounding ice, the serum could theoretically repair damaged neural tissue." I held up the blood sample, the red liquid dark against the foam padding. "I kept this from his last blood draw before the accident. I've had it frozen at exactly the right temperature for 6 months, waiting for the right opportunity." "Jesus," Russell whispered, the word barely audible above the heating unit's steady hum. I closed the case and turned to face him, seeing my own desperation reflected in his eyes. His expression moved between horror and something that looked like understanding, the careful mask of professional skepticism replaced by something more human and immediate. "You think this location will work?" he asked quietly. "For the serum?" "According to the research, the conditions down in that crevasse are perfect. The temperature, the pressure differential, the mineral content of the ice formations, everything matches what the experiments suggested would be optimal for neural regeneration." Russell sat down heavily on one of the equipment crates, the metal groaning softly under his weight. He pulled off his outer gloves and rubbed his face with both hands, processing what I'd told him. When he looked up, his eyes had changed completely. The suspicion was gone, replaced by something that looked like recognition mixed with a deep, familiar pain. "Andrew, even if this serum works the way you think it will, Lucas has been in a coma for 6 months, he said carefully. The brain damage from that kind of trauma. There's no guarantee the regeneration process could restore his cognitive function to pre-injury levels. I know, I cut him off, hearing the desperation in my own voice echo off the tent walls. I know it might not work perfectly. I know it might not really heal him completely. But I have to try. The words came out in a rush, months of pent-up guilt and hope spilling over. I was supposed to pick him up that night. If I hadn't been on that conference call, if I'd just left the office 10 minutes earlier. Russell held up a hand, stopping my spiral into self-recrimination. He stood up and walked to the Ihua's tent opening, looking out toward the crevasse where the wind was beginning to pick up again. The fabric of our shelter rippled around us, creating shadows that danced across the equipment scattered around the tent floor. I understand, he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the sound of wind and the heating unit's steady hum. Do you? I asked, surprised by the certainty in his tone. More than you know? Russell turned back toward me, and I could see something shift in his expression, a decision being made in real time. My daughter died in a climbing accident 3 years ago. Katie. She fell from a cliff face in Yosemite, just 2 weeks after graduating from college. She was 22, had her whole life ahead of her, was planning to start graduate school in environmental science. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. In 15 years of working together, Russell had never mentioned having a daughter. I'd known he was divorced, that he lived alone, but he'd always been intensely private about his personal life. When you put out the call for this expedition, Russell continued, I volunteered specifically because I recognized something in the way you were planning it, the secrecy, the specific location, the equipment that didn't match our stated research goals. He gestured toward my case. I thought maybe if you found something down there, something that could help Lucas, maybe you'd be willing to try it on someone who was already dead. I stared at Russell's profile as he continued looking toward the dark opening in the ice. The morning light was beginning to strengthen slightly, painting the snow around our camp in shades of pale blue and gray. You knew what I was really planning? I suspected. Your equipment requests didn't match anything we'd need for routine climate monitoring. The insulated medical containers, the precision temperature controls, the specific coordinates that corresponded to no known geological formations of interest. He turned back toward me. I did some research after you posted the expedition parameters, found records of classified government research into permafrost microorganisms, put together the timeline with Lucas's accident. Russell walked back to where I sat beside my case, his movements careful and deliberate. The difference is Lucas is still alive. If that serum works on damaged neural tissue, maybe it could work on dead tissue too. Maybe it could bring Katie back. The tent fell silent, except for the wind outside and the steady mechanical breathing of our heating system. I looked at Russell with new understanding, seeing the same desperate hope in his eyes that I'd been carrying for months. We were both men who'd lost everything that mattered, clinging to science as our last chance at redemption. She was going to change the world, Russell said, his voice thick with emotion. Katie had this passion for environmental protection, this belief that her generation could fix the mistakes we'd made. She wanted to study glacial formation in the Arctic, to understand how climate change was affecting polar ecosystems. I thought about Lucas, about his dreams of playing college soccer, about the plans he'd made for his junior year of high school. All of it cut short by one moment of someone else's carelessness, leaving us to imagine what might have been. We spent the next hour finishing our descent preparations in a strange new atmosphere of shared desperation and understanding. The deception was gone, replaced by collaboration born from mutual loss. Russell helped me pack Lucas's blood and the serum into a specially insulated carrier that would protect them during the climb down, his hands steady and professional despite the emotional weight of what we were planning. Neither of us talked much about the technical aspects of what I intended to do, but the silence felt different now, less tense, more purposeful. Russell understood the kind of grief that made impossible choices seem reasonable, and I understood that I wasn't the only one seeking salvation in the frozen depths of Antarctica. The climbing anchors went into the ice easily, the metal biting deep into the frozen surface, at the edge of the crevasse with sharp, ringing sounds that echoed into the darkness below. Russell tested each anchor personally, putting his full weight on the ropes before declaring them secure. His movements were more careful than usual, as if the stakes had suddenly become much more personal. 50 feet to the first ledge, he said, checking his GPS readings against the topographical data we'd studied the night before. From there, it opens up into what looks like a natural chamber system. The geological surveys suggest multiple caverns carved out by water flow over thousands of years. I secured the insulated carrier to my climbing harness, making sure the vials couldn't shift during the descent. The weight felt significant, not just the physical mass of the equipment, but the emotional weight of everything I was carrying down into the darkness. Lucas's future, Russell's hope for his daughter, and the possibility of either miracle or disaster. Russell clicked on his headlamp and moved to the edge of the crevasse, the beam cutting through the morning gloom to reveal ice walls that descended into blue-black shadows. The light seemed to be absorbed by the darkness below, creating the illusion that we were standing at the edge of an infinite void. The wind had picked up again, creating an eerie whistling sound as it moved through the opening. "You ready for this?" Russell asked, his voice steady despite everything we just shared. The professional researcher was back in control, channeling his grief into focused action. I activated my own headlamp and joined him at the edge, feeling the cold radiating up from the depths like breath from some sleeping giant. The beams of light cut through the darkness, revealing blue-tinted ice walls that disappeared into deeper shadows. The crevasse was wider than it had appeared from our camp, and I could see geological formations that spoke of millions of years of pressure and movement. "Ready," I said, though I wasn't sure I'd ever be truly ready for what I was planning to do down there. Russell rappelled down first, his movements controlled and professional as he descended into the void. I watched his light grow smaller, bouncing off the ice walls as he worked his way down the rope. His voice echoed up from the darkness, distorted by the acoustics of the narrow space. "Wall integrity looks good," he called up. "Ice is solid, no signs of recent shifting or instability." I followed a few minutes later, my boots finding purchase against the ice wall as I worked my way down the rope. The descent felt like entering another world. The temperature dropped noticeably as we went deeper, and the sound of our breathing echoed off the narrow walls in ways that made it seem like we weren't alone down there. Ice crystals formed on my face mask within minutes, and I had to periodically clear my goggles to maintain visibility. The walls themselves were mesmerizing, layers of ice compressed over millennia into formations that looked almost organic. Mineral deposits created streaks of color, deep blues, pale greens, and occasional veins of what looked like silver running through the frozen matrix. The ice was so clear in places that I could see air bubbles trapped thousands of years ago, ancient atmosphere preserved in crystalline suspension. The first ledge was exactly where Russell had predicted, a natural shelf in the ice formation that provided a stable platform about 50 feet below the surface. Russell was already exploring the area when I reached it, his headlamp beam revealing an opening that led deeper into the ice. The platform felt solid under our boots, but I could hear water moving somewhere in the distance, a sound that reminded me how dynamic these formations really were. "Natural chamber system," Russell confirmed, pointing toward the opening with a gloved hand. "Goes back at least 30 feet, maybe more. The acoustic properties suggest it opens up significantly once you get past the initial passage." I unclipped from the rope and followed Russell through the opening, feeling the space expand around us as we moved away from the narrow crevasse. The passage was tall enough for us to walk upright, carved smooth by centuries of meltwater flow. Our footsteps echoed in ways that suggested vast spaces beyond our lights. The chamber beyond exceeded all my expectations. It was roughly circular, with a ceiling high enough that our headlamps couldn't reach it. The walls were smooth blue ice, carved by natural processes into flowing, organic shapes that looked almost intentionally artistic. Geological formations jutted from the floor and walls like frozen waterfalls, and I could see passages leading deeper into the ice in multiple directions. "This is perfect," I said, examining the mineral streaks visible in the ice formations around us. Everything matched the environmental parameters I'd studied in the research notes. The temperature was holding steady, at exactly the level the experiments had indicated would be optimal, and I could feel the atmospheric pressure difference that came from being this far below the surface. Russell set up a portable work light while I unpacked the serum and Lucas's blood sample, the LED array casting harsh shadows against the chamber walls but providing enough illumination for detailed work. The insulated carrier had performed perfectly during the descent. Both the serum and blood sample showed no signs of thermal damage or contamination. "How long does the process take?" Russell asked, positioning himself near the chamber entrance where he could monitor for any changes in the ice structure or unexpected visitors. His voice echoed strangely in the large space, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. According to the research, approximately 30 minutes from injection to initial neural activity, I said, setting up my equipment with the same precision I'd used during countless laboratory experiments. Assuming it works at all, I opened Lucas's blood sample first, the small vial containing the neural tissue sample I'd kept frozen since before his accident. The blood had remained solid during transport, but it would need to thaw slightly before I could mix it with the serum. I held the vial carefully, watching my son's blood begin to liquefy in the relative warmth of our work area. Russell's headlamp beam swept back and forth across the chamber entrance, checking for any signs of structural instability or unexpected changes in the ice. The formations around us creaked and settled occasionally, the sound echoing through the chamber like the breathing of some enormous creature. "You know," Russell said quietly, his voice carrying a note of careful consideration, "even if this works exactly the way you hope it will, it won't bring Lucas back to exactly where he was before the accident. Neural regeneration isn't the same as memory restoration or personality recovery." "I know," I said, preparing the syringe I would use to combine the blood and serum. "But maybe having my son alive and aware is better than having him lost in that coma forever." Russell didn't argue. He understood the kind of desperation that made impossible choices seem not just reasonable, but necessary. I mixed Lucas's blood with the experimental serum slowly, watching the clear liquid take on a faint reddish tinge as the two substances combined. The solution remained stable at the new temperature, showing no signs of the degradation or separation that would indicate chemical incompatibility. The mixture seemed to glow softly in the LED light, though that might have been my imagination investing ordinary fluid with supernatural significance. "Temperature is holding steady at -42, Russell reported, checking his instruments with the methodical precision that had made him an excellent research partner for 15 years. "Atmospheric pressure is exactly what your research notes predicted. Mineral content in the surrounding ice shows high concentrations of trace elements that match your optimal parameters." Everything was ready. The chamber provided perfect conditions according to the stolen research data: extreme cold, specific atmospheric pressure, mineral-rich ice formations that would supposedly catalyze the microorganism's regenerative properties. I held the syringe containing the mixture that might heal my son's damaged brain, trying to prepare myself for whatever would happen next. The plan was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. I would inject the serum into my own bloodstream, allowing the microorganisms to adapt to human physiology before extracting a sample and preserving it for transport back to Lucas. The research suggested that the organisms needed to activate in living tissue before they could effectively repair neural damage, and I was the only test subject available. From somewhere deeper in the chamber system, beyond the reach of our lights, came a sound that might have been shifting ice. Russell's headlamp beam snapped toward the noise, probing the shadows that filled the passages leading away from our work area. The sound echoed strangely in the large space, seeming to come from multiple directions before fading into silence. "Probably just thermal expansion," Russell said, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty I hadn't heard before. "These formations are constantly settling as temperature changes affect the ice structure." I focused on the syringe in my hands, pushing away thoughts of anything except Lucas and the possibility of seeing him wake up again. Whatever was moving in the deeper shadows of the chamber could wait. The experimental window was limited. The serum would only remain stable at these temperatures for another hour or two before the cellular structure began to break down. The sound came again from deeper in the chamber, and this time it was accompanied by something else, a scraping noise like metal being dragged across ice, rhythmic and deliberate in a way that suggested intentional movement rather than natural settling. Russell's headlamp beam swept toward the source, cutting through shadows that seemed to shift and move independently of our lights. The portable work light we'd set up cast harsh illumination across our immediate work area, but beyond its reach, the chamber extended into darkness that could hide almost anything. "Andrew," Russell said quietly, his voice carrying a note of concern that made my blood run cold. "We might not be alone down here." I looked up from the syringe, following his gaze toward the back of the chamber. The LED lights created stark contrasts between illuminated ice and impenetrable shadow, and for a moment, I thought I saw something moving in the darkness, a suggestion of shape that didn't match the organic curves of the ice formations. A figure emerged from the depths of the chamber, stepping into the edge of our light with movements that immediately struck me as profoundly wrong. The way it walked was too stiff, too angular, like each step required conscious effort rather than natural coordination. Its limbs moved independently, as if different parts of its body were being controlled by separate systems that didn't communicate effectively with each other. "Hey," Russell called out, his voice echoing off the chamber walls with a hollow quality that made his words sound distorted and strange. "Hello, are you okay? Are you injured?" The figure continued moving toward us with that same mechanical gait, but didn't respond to Russell's calls. It made no acknowledgement that it had heard him, no gesture of greeting or distress. Its head remained fixed in position, staring straight ahead with an intensity that made my skin crawl. As it came closer, details became visible that transformed my initial concern into something approaching horror. The limbs were too long, stretched beyond normal human proportions in ways that suggested the bones had been pulled apart and reassembled incorrectly. The arms hung at its sides, swaying with each jerky step, and the legs seemed to bend at angles that hurt to look at. But it was the face that made me drop the syringe entirely. Watching the glass vial shatter against the ice floor and spread my son's blood and the experimental serum in a dark stain across the chamber. Human features, yes, but arranged in a way that suggested they'd been taken apart and reassembled by someone who didn't quite understand how they were supposed to fit together. The eyes sat too high on the skull, the mouth too low, and everything was covered by skin that looked waxy and artificial under our lights. The overall effect was of a mannequin that had been melted and reformed by an inexperienced sculptor. "Russell," I whispered, but he was already moving, positioning himself between me and the approaching figure with the protective instincts of someone who'd spent decades in dangerous environments. "Sir, we're researchers," Russell said, raising his hands in what might have been a calming gesture, though his voice carried a tremor that betrayed his growing unease. "Are you injured? Do you need help? Can you tell us how you got down here?" The creature, because that's what it was, not a person, despite the superficial resemblance to human anatomy, tilted its head at an unnatural angle, studying Russell like he was some kind of puzzle that required careful analysis before action. Then, without any warning or change in expression, it lunged forward with speed that seemed impossible for something that had been moving so awkwardly just seconds before. Its elongated arms wrapped around Russell with predatory efficiency, the movements so fluid and coordinated that it was clear the mechanical gait had been either deception or limitation rather than inability. Russell's scream cut through the chamber like a blade, a sound of pure agony that bounced off the ice walls and came back amplified from multiple directions. The acoustic properties of the space transformed his cry into something inhuman, as if the chamber itself was screaming. I could hear the crushing sound as the creature's grip tightened around Russell's chest, followed by the horrible wet crack of ribs breaking under pressure that no human being could generate. The thing's arms had stretched even further during the attack, wrapping around Russell's torso with coils that reminded me of a snake constricting its prey. But there was something mechanical about the way the pressure increased. Precise increments of force applied with calculated timing, rather than the wild desperation of a predatory animal. Russell's legs kicked helplessly, his boots scrambling for purchase on the ice floor as the creature lifted him partially off the ground. His face had gone white with pain and shock, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to speak or breathe, but only producing choked gasps that echoed wetly in the chamber. My hand shook violently as I fumbled for the flare gun in my pack, watching my friend and research partner struggle against something that clearly possessed strength, far beyond what its distorted frame should have been able to support. The creature's grip continued to tighten with mechanical precision, and I could see Russell's ribs deforming under the pressure. The flare gun felt impossibly heavy in my hands as I raised it, my vision blurring with adrenaline and terror. I tried to get a clear shot without hitting Russell, but the creature's elongated body was pressed against his back, its misshapen head visible over his shoulder. Russell's struggles were growing weaker, his movements becoming sporadic and uncontrolled. I pulled the trigger. The flare struck the creature directly in the chest with a burst of red light and chemical fire. Its clothing immediately caught fire, the synthetic material burning with bright flames that cast dancing shadows across the chamber walls. The thing stumbled backward, releasing Russell as fire spread across its upper body, but it made no sound. No scream of pain or surprise, no acknowledgement that anything had happened at all. Russell collapsed onto the ice floor with a wet impact that told me everything I needed to know about the internal damage that had been done. Blood began pooling beneath him immediately. dark, and spreading across the blue-white surface of the chamber floor in patterns that looked almost artistic under our lights. The creature hit the far wall of the chamber, still burning. It turned its head toward me with that same mechanical precision, and through the flames consuming its face, I could see those wrongly placed eyes focusing on me with what looked like recognition rather than pain or fear. "No more children," it said, in a voice that sounded like gravel being ground together in a cement mixer. Each word was forced out with obvious effort, as if speech was a function it had learned imperfectly. The flames continued to consume its clothing and exposed skin, but it showed no reaction to what should have been excruciating agony. Then it slumped against the ice wall and went still, the flames continuing to consume whatever material its clothing had been made from. The smell of burning synthetic fabric mixed with something else, something organic and unpleasant that made my stomach turn. I dropped the flare gun and rushed to Russell's side, kneeling in the spreading pool of blood that was already beginning to freeze at the edges. His chest rose and fell in shallow, irregular gasps that created small clouds in the frigid air. When he tried to speak, pink foam bubbled from the corner of his mouth, mixing blood and air in a way that indicated severe internal damage. "Russell, stay with me," I said, pressing my hands against his chest, where I could feel broken ribs shifting under his skin like loose puzzle pieces. The fabric of his jacket was torn from the creature's grip, and I could see dark bruises spreading across his exposed skin. "I'm going to get you out of here." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. Russell's eyes found mine, and in them, I could see the same knowledge. His breathing was getting weaker with each breath, the pauses between them growing longer and more pronounced. He was drowning in his own blood, and there was nothing I could do about it with the equipment we had available. The burned remains of the creature lay against the chamber wall about 20 feet away, smoke still rising from its charred body in thin tendrils that dissipated in the chamber's air currents. In the flickering light of the remaining flames, I could make out human-like features beneath the destroyed flesh. Teeth arranged in something approaching normal dental formation, part of a jawline that looked familiar, what might have been an ear in the wrong position. This thing had been human once. Someone had undergone the same kind of transformation I'd been planning to attempt with the experimental serum, and this was the result. Not healing or regeneration, but corruption into something that wore human features like an uncomfortable mask, while something else operated the controls from inside. Russell's hand moved weakly against the ice, his fingers trying to close around something that wasn't there. His lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear above his labored breathing. I leaned closer, trying to catch what he was saying. "Katie," he whispered, so quietly I almost missed it. Don't try to bring her back." Those were the last words Russell Kane ever spoke. I stayed beside Russell's body long after his breathing stopped, my hands still gripping his cold fingers through our gloves. The silence in the chamber pressed against my eardrums with physical weight, broken only by the occasional crack of settling ice somewhere in the darkness beyond our lights and the steady drip of melting ice from the chamber ceiling. 20 minutes passed before I finally forced myself to move. The emergency radio. Russell would have packed it with the standard expedition equipment, probably in his main gear bag that we'd brought down during the descent. I needed to call for extraction, needed to report what had happened here, though I had no idea how to explain what we'd encountered. My legs felt unsteady as I stood up, the reality of Russell's death hitting me in waves that made it difficult to think clearly. The chamber suddenly felt enormous and threatening, shadows seeming to move independently in my peripheral vision. Every sound echoed with new significance. Was that ice settling, or something else moving in the passages that led deeper into the formation? Russell's pack sat near the chamber entrance, where he dropped it when we'd set up the work area. I knelt beside it and began pulling out items methodically, my hands working automatically while my mind struggled to process what I would tell the rescue team. Extra batteries, medical supplies, emergency rations, climbing gear, all the familiar contents of a routine research expedition. Beneath the medical kit, my fingers found something unexpected that made my breath catch in my throat. An envelope, sealed and marked with my name in Russell's careful handwriting. The date written in the corner made my stomach drop. 2 days before we'd left Palmer Station. I tore open the envelope with shaking hands, unfolding a single sheet of paper covered in Russell's neat script. The LED work light cast harsh shadows across the text, making it difficult to read, but the words were unmistakable. Andrew, if you're reading this, something has gone wrong with our expedition, and I'm probably dead. I need you to know that I've understood your real purpose from the beginning. The equipment requests, the secrecy, the specific coordinates you chose, none of it matched a standard climate monitoring mission. I did some research after you posted the expedition parameters, found records of missing experimental materials from classified permafrost studies, put together the timeline with Lucas's accident, and figured out what you were really planning. I volunteered for this mission specifically to help you. Not because I believed your cover story about routine research, but because I hoped that if you found a way to heal Lucas, you might be willing to try the same thing on Katie. I know you'll think I was using you, but that's not how it was. I wanted to help you succeed because I understand what it means to lose everything that matters. The difference is you still have a chance to save your son. I'm hoping we can help each other. If something happens to me down there, don't blame yourself. I chose to come here knowing the risks. I'd rather die trying to do something meaningful than waste away with guilt and regret. Your friend, Russell. The letter fell from my numb fingers and landed on the ice beside Russell's motionless form. He had known everything, not just suspected, but known about the serum, Lucas's condition, my desperate plan to heal my son's damaged brain. He had come here to die for me, hoping I might save his daughter in return. But I'd seen what the serum actually did. The creature that had killed Russell had been human once, transformed by the same microorganisms I'd planned to use on Lucas. The research I'd stolen from the government facility had been incomplete or deliberately misleading. This wasn't about healing, it was about creating something else entirely. The burned remains of our attacker lay against the chamber wall, smoke no longer rising from his charred body. In the flickering light from our work area, I could make out details that made my stomach turn. Human features beneath the destroyed flesh, definitely human, though arranged wrong. Part of a jawbone, teeth that looked normal except for their placement, an ear that had somehow migrated to the wrong side of the head. I walked back to where my case sat open beside Russell's body. The remaining vials of experimental serum still sat secure in their foam padding, undamaged despite everything that had happened. The mixture I'd prepared was gone, spilled across the ice when the creature's appearance had startled me into dropping the syringe. But there was still enough serum to attempt the procedure again. Russell had wanted this. He had written it down, made his choice before we ever left civilization. His daughter Katie had been dead for 3 years, and he had chosen to spend his remaining hope helping me instead of accepting that loss was permanent. The experimental notes had been clear about the mixture ratios, the injection sites, the optimal timing for maximum effectiveness. I could use Russell's blood, fresh and still warm, mixed with the serum. The research suggested that recent death actually provided better conditions for reanimation than older tissue. My hands moved toward the case without conscious decision, lifting out one of the remaining serum vials. Russell lay on his back where he had died, his chest still and his face relaxed in death, despite the violence of his final moments. The injection site would be easy to find. The prominent vein in his left arm was still accessible, despite the damage to his torso. I prepared the syringe with the same careful precision I had planned to use for Lucas, watching the clear serum mix with Russell's blood in proportions dictated by stolen research notes. The solution took on that same faint reddish tinge I'd observed earlier, seeming to glow with its own inner light. Russell had risked everything to help me save my son. The least I could do was try to save his daughter in return, even if the results weren't what either of us had hoped for. I knelt beside him and found the vein, inserting the needle with steady hands despite the magnitude of what I was attempting. The serum mixture disappeared into Russell's circulation, and I sat back to wait. According to the research, reanimation took approximately 30 minutes, if it worked at all. Nothing happened for the first 20 minutes. No movement, no change in Russell's skin color, no sign that the serum was having any effect on his dead tissue. I began to think the experiment had failed completely, that I had wasted the mixture I could have saved for Lucas. The chamber remained silent, except for the steady drip of melting ice and the occasional crack of thermal expansion somewhere in the darkness. Then Russell's fingers twitched. At first I thought it might have been my imagination or some kind of post-mortem muscle spasm. But then it happened again, a deliberate flexing of his right hand that made his knuckles crack audibly in the chamber silence. The sound echoed off the walls with sharp precision, too intentional to be natural. Russell's chest began to rise and fall, with shallow, mechanical breaths that created small clouds in the frigid air. His head turned slightly toward me, with movements that reminded me of clockwork, precise, but somehow wrong. When his eyes opened, they were completely white, with no trace of iris or pupil visible, just blank, milky orbs that tracked my movement like sensors rather than organs of sight. No recognition, no warmth, no trace of the Russell Kane who had been my research partner and friend for 15 years. Just empty white eyes that studied me with the same predatory interest I had seen from the creature that killed him. Russell began sitting up with mechanical precision, his broken ribs apparently no longer an issue for whatever was animating his corpse. His head turned toward me in small, jerky increments, like someone operating machinery they didn't quite understand. The resemblance to our attacker was unmistakable. The same unnatural movements, the same absence of human expression. "Russell," I whispered, though I already knew this thing wasn't going to answer me the way my friend would have. The white eyes blinked once, slowly, but Russell's mouth remained closed. He shifted his weight and began to stand, his legs unfolding beneath him with that same mechanical precision I had witnessed before. Each movement looked like it required conscious calculation, as if the thing inside Russell's body was still learning how to operate human limbs. Russell's chest showed no sign of the crushing damage that had killed him. The broken ribs had apparently reset themselves, and the massive internal bleeding had stopped completely. Whatever the serum had done, it had repaired the physical trauma while transforming him into something else entirely. I scrambled backward across the ice, putting distance between myself and the thing that used to be my friend. My back hit the chamber wall, and I realized I had nowhere else to go. Russell stood at his full height now, his body already showing early signs of the grotesque transformation I had witnessed in the first creature. That's when I heard the helicopter rotors. The sound started as a distant thrum that grew louder by the second, rotor blades cutting through the Antarctic air somewhere above our position. The rescue team had arrived exactly on schedule, just like they had promised over the radio 6 hours ago. "Help!" I screamed toward the crevasse opening, my voice cracking as it echoed through the chamber. "Down here! Help me!" The Russell creature's head turned upward at the sound, its attention shifting away from me for the first time since it had stood up. Those elongated arms dropped to its sides as it focused on the helicopter noise above us, head tilting at that same unnatural angle. Voices carried down from the surface, professional and calm as the rescue team established their position. I could hear equipment being moved around, the metallic clink of climbing gear being arranged for descent. They had no idea what they were about to find down here. Ropes dropped through the opening, followed by the first rescue team member rappelling down with practiced efficiency. His headlamp swept across the chamber as he descended, taking in the scene below. Me pressed against the wall, Russell's motionless figure standing in the center of the ice floor, the charred remains of the original creature. "Christ," the rescuer said into his radio as his boots touched the chamber floor. "We've got one survivor and one injured. Kane looks like he's got severe hypothermia damage, but he's standing." 2 more team members descended, moving with quick efficiency while maintaining radio contact with the helicopter above. None of them seemed to notice that Russell wasn't breathing normally, or that his proportions were subtly wrong for a human being. "Russell Kane is dead," I shouted at them, my voice echoing off the ice walls. "That's not Russell anymore. You need to stay away from it." The lead rescuer looked at me with the expression medical professionals reserve for people in shock. "Sir, we need you to stay calm. Your partner is clearly injured, but we're going to get both of you out of here." They ignored my protests, approaching Russell's transformed body with medical bags and equipment. The creature stood perfectly still as they examined it, allowing them to check its vitals and assess its condition. To their instruments, Russell looked like a man who had survived terrible trauma. I watched helplessly as they prepared Russell for transport, loading him onto a stretcher while I continued to protest. The creature allowed itself to be moved without resistance, playing dead convincingly enough to fool trained medical personnel. By the time they hauled me to the surface, Russell's body was already loaded into the helicopter's medical bay. I could see the stretcher through the aircraft's windows. No movement visible from the creature inside, but I knew it was conscious and aware. The helicopter lifted off with Russell's reanimated corpse secured in the medical bay, disappearing into the Antarctic sky while I stood on the ice and watched it go. I had released something terrible into the world, disguised as a rescue operation that everyone believed had saved a man's life. But in my pack, carefully protected, the remaining vials of serum sat undamaged. Everything I needed to attempt the same procedure on Lucas if I was willing to risk creating another monster. Looking back at the dark opening where Russell had died and been reborn as something else, I made my choice. Some losses were meant to be permanent, and some desperate fathers needed to learn when to let go. I destroyed the remaining serum that night, watching it freeze into the Antarctic ice forever.